In this session, we're going to focus on the infrastructure behind the Hello Gravity application. So as built previously, we have a user interface that is a simple master detail application. But let's take a look at the application domain structure that has been built by Gravity and ultimately on the domain model that it uses. Gravity creates many different layers of application domains within the Flex environment. Let's walk through what we have. It starts with the Gravity Bootstrapper that was configured as part of the initial setup of the application, which caused the main manifest file to be loaded. Based on that, it created a top-level interface domain. Now this is the top-level domain for your application. All interfaces will be loaded here such that they will be shared and common across all other domains. Beneath that, Gravity will be loading the shared Flex SDKs. This was part of the initial configuration of the top level of some of the top level configuration files. And there you've declared in this particular example that we're going to be using a 3.x or say 3.6 shared Flex SDK or 4.1 or 4.5. In this case I've got two of them done. Now as was done previously in the previous video, the UI services are using a common shared Flex SDK. So the application and detail editor in this case are all using a shared Flex SDK of 4.5, and this sample is showing that the list and the header were using a different SDK. In fact, our samples were using all the same SDK just due to time constraints and size constraints, but there's no reason you can't wire it up exactly as shown here. So this would allow different portions of the applications to be built using different Flex SDKs. Now note though that the data that drives this SDK is based on a domain model. Now domain models typically come in two portions, or other services come in two portions. They come in the bundle part and a separate SWIF for the interfaces. This allows the interfaces to be loaded at the top level such that they can be shared across all different SDKs and the domain classes to be independent of all of that. Now within the domain bundles, they can register services to be used elsewhere. Now note that all of the sharing across these modules have to be done using interfaces. Let's take a closer look at the domain service that's behind the editors that we were using earlier. So in this case, we've got a domain bundle and an interface bundle. And the interfaces are going to be loaded at the top level, and the domain is underneath that. Note that in this case we've got two different classes of interest. There's a media manager class and an individual piece of media that represents one of the images that we were seeing on screen. It's only the media manager though that is exposed as a service. So this was our iMedia service that is exposing the implementation class of this media manager, but in this case, it was the master list and the editor are using the service. These editors do not know about the implementation details of this class. Let's take a look at the code. The first thing that we notice is that for the domains is that there is two different projects, one for the interfaces and the other one for the bundles. If we take a look at the interfaces first, you will first of all notice that these are actually library projects. So they're compiling out SWIC files, not SWIFT files. As you can see here, if we drill into the source files here, there's a couple of different packages, one for domain and one for manager in this example. And let's take a look at our domain object first. Our domain object is implementing iMedia, and it is just an interface for the simple getters and setters of the property. This media object is really just a simple value object in this case. It could be more complex and have properties and methods on it, but this one doesn't. So it's very, very simple getters and setters. The media manager has a little bit more to it. The media manager is exposing a getter for a list of media objects. It has a getter and setter for what is considered to be an active media, so the one that happens to be selected at the time, and a couple of methods, one for adding and one for deleting media. So this is the interface that is available and useful to the list part of our application. If we take a look at the Gravity configuration manifest file for this interface, it's under manifest. Note that this is a source file like was done in other samples. So we've brought that into a source file of our project. If we take a look at that, you'll notice that it is declaring itself as an interface. This is the tag that causes it to be loaded to the top-level application domain. The location of this is hello gravity domain interface.swif. Now that's a little bit confusing actually, is that this is a library project, yet what we actually need is a SWIF file, not a SWIC file. And we'll show you how to actually do the linkage at the main application later. But just do take note here is that what we're ultimately going to need for this interface is the SWIF file. So we've got the domain interface SWIF, and here we're declaring that this particular interface is going to export an iMedia Manager. Now note that this particular interface SWIF file will in fact contain all of the interfaces for the domain. So it's going to include the iMedia Manager interface as well as the iMedia interface. However, the only service that is involved at the time is the one that is the iMedia Manager. If we go back and take a look at iMedia Manager can pass as part of its interface, it can pass iMedia objects. So this is it saying is that this particular service is using other interfaces, which are domain interfaces, but it's not actually using iMedia as a service directly. It's the iMedia Manager is the service. Let's take a look at the domain bundle where the domain is actually implemented. So again, this is a library project, has source files and a manifest file, and this time I'm going to actually show you the configuration for setting up the manifest. It's pretty straightforward, but you just go into the build Flex Library build path, source path, and here you would have said add folder manifest to make that a source folder. The reason we want to do that is that we consider the manifest file part of the source for our projects, so we'd like to have it as a source file, and later we're going to need to copy that manifest file into the output directory so it's available at runtime. Okay, so if we go back in and take a look at this source, it will match very closely to what the interface was before. So there's two packages, a domain and a manager. The implementation for our media, so this is the domain object, and as you would expect, it is just a set of getters and setters for the various properties of this particular media object. Let's take a look at the media manager. So if we open that, you'll see the media manager does implement its interface as would be expected. Now the important point to note here is that we're exposing the media list, and that media list is a iList. iList, even though it's a Flex class, it is a class, an interface that is common across all of the Flex SDKs, and Gravity brings that into the top-level application domain automatically. So it's possible to use iList to pass list data across the boundaries between Flex SDKs, but you cannot use something like an array collection, because if you were to do that, it would cause the Flex to be dragged into the top-level application domain, and you would end up with far too much data, or far too much into the top-level application domain, and you wouldn't be able to share or use different Flex SDKs. So we've got a media list here. We've also got an active media of type iMedia, and then the corresponding getters and setters. Now I'll let you go through this code independently. It's relatively straightforward, but what you'll find is that it's just doing a fairly simple API, exposing the media list and setting the active media and so on. The manifest file for the domain object, if we open that, you'll see that again that this is a bundle location domain bundle.swif. Now again, this is a library project. It typically generates a SWIC file, and in fact if you do look here you'll see that it is generating a SWIC file at this level, but what we ultimately need is a SWIF file. So by the time it gets to runtime we need to extract the SWIF out of the SWIC file, and we'll use RSL linking to do that, which will be shown later. So this bundle, its domain, we're going to name this domain actually, because we want to use this domain as a parent domain elsewhere. So this particular domain bundle has got a name called Hello Gravity, or Hello Gravity Domain Model is the name of our domain that we're going to give it, and it's given a start order because we want it to start before some other bundles. This is saying that this particular bundle is using an iMedia Manager because of course we're exposing that ourselves, but it's also using Media Data Service. Let me go back to the Media Manager implementation and show you that. So this particular Media Manager implementation is expecting a Media Data Service of a type iMedia Data Service, and that will be bind injected to us. So from the perspective of this particular domain class, we're relying on a Media Data Service to be looked up by Gravity and injected into this class. Back to our configuration. Here's our beans section coming. So we're going to say we need to, let's just expand that so we get everything, you can see it all at once. We're going to expose a service, and the implementation is going to be this bean, which is a Media Manager right here. So this is the Media Manager of the class that we just implemented. So this is our Media Manager class, and this will be exposed as a service here against the iMedia Manager interface. So that's why the Media Manager was available to the UI services used in previous session. Now this Media Manager though in turn actually needs another service to already exist. So it's going to be injected a Media Data Service which was bound by looking up a different service. So here we're saying is that an iMedia Data Service exists out there in the environment somewhere. Somebody somewhere has already registered a service. We're going to go look it up, register it or reference it according to this name, and then bind it into our Media Manager. Again, graphically, what we just configured is the following, is that we've got our Media Manager. It exposed itself as a service called iMedia Service, which of course was then used by the list in the editor. This Media Manager, as part of its API, is using media objects. So this is why we actually have the data available to us in list form and a single selection. But the Media Manager in turn is using a service that was already published into our environment called an iMedia Data Service. The next session we'll discuss the configuration of the Media Data Service.